Welcome, everybody. Thank you for this webinar hosted by Trade Capital Corp, Navigating the Turbulence of the Automotive Industry. It's a real pleasure to have you all here as guests, and then our panelists, which we will introduce here shortly. I'll introduce myself. I'm Todd Throckmorton. I'm with the advisory group with Trade Capital Corp and Client Relations. And so with that, it's a real pleasure to start making some introductions here. And first I want to start off with is Jinwon Kim. Jinwon, thank you for being here. Jinwon is Vice President Supply Chain with Monarch Tractor. Jinwon has a wide breadth of experience in managing various commodities and suppliers in the context of established OEMs such as Renault, Nissan, Renault Samsung Motors, as well as extensive experience scaling and building supply chains while at Tesla. Currently, he is the VP of Supply Chain at Monarch Tractor, and with his team, he is building and growing a supply chain to support the implementation and growth of electrification and autonomy in the agricultural industry. So, Jinwon, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, Mr. Burt Jordan, retired Vice President, Global Purchasing, Ford Motor Company. Burt Jordan is currently the president of Atlantic Coastal Acquisition Corporation, which is a $345 million special purpose acquisition corporation focused on next generation mobility. Jordan retired from Ford Motor Company during the summer of 2020. Prior to retiring, Jordan was the vice president, global purchasing operations and supply chain sustainability. He was responsible for driving strategy, transformational growth, and efficiencies through program growth, delivery, purchasing, strategy, and supply chain sustainability. He joined Ford in 1999 after a couple stints with General Motors, Toyota, and United Technologies. So, Mr. Jordan, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
As Jim said, thank you for having me.
And next up, we have Mr. Peter Hassenkamp, Strategic Advisor in Global Supply Chain Strategies. Peter's experience and understanding of the automotive industry is exemplary. He's a highly accomplished purchasing and product development leader with more than 20 years of experience in automotive supply chain management, international operations, product development, and team leadership. Until recently, Peter was Lucid Motors Vice President Supply Chain, responsible for sourcing, selecting, and ensuring the quality of Lucid's key suppliers and managing the global logistics strategy between supply chain and manufacturing. Prior to Lucid, he was with Director of Vehicle Systems with Tesla. So thank you very much, Peter, for being here.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
And to round it out, we have Mandeep Sahota, Strategic Advisor, Business Process Excellence. And Mandeep's journey begins at Johnson Controls as VP of Operations, where he oversaw end-to-end supply chain for building management solutions, which encompass controls, fire detection, and security units. Additionally, he led the global planning and material control leader for the COE at Johnson Controls. And prior to his time at JCI, Mandeep spent 15 years at General Electric Company. And Mandeep, thank you for being here.
Great, thanks for having me.
That was a lot for me to read. And so now I get to turn it over to all you guys and let you speak. And with that, Mr. Jordan, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen over the past couple of weeks and how the UAW strike is impacting automotive companies and their supply base. And I think really looking at that from a supply chain resiliency and disruptions. What's your vision? What's your insight? What can you share with our audience?
Well, what I can tell you is I know that everyone is happy that the 6-week strike is over now. It's had a tremendous toll on not just the industry, but the ancillary industries that on the perimeter as well in terms of what it affects. It was historic. It's the first time in history that all three of the Detroit Three were stricken at the same time. So that was unprecedented. And having talked to some of my former colleagues, friends in the industry, really the biggest struggle they're having right now is labor still. They had labor problems going into this ever since the pandemic. but now they're really concerned about how they start up. I think we've seen that once this supply chain stops, it's really difficult to get it started again on a global basis. And so they're really running into labor issues, whether it's the shortage of labor, whether it's onboard and training, and then just the general retention issue. Those are all critical issues for them to manage right now. At the same time, they're trying to manage the inflationary pricing that's coming from the lower tiers in terms of how they're going to manage that. Most believe that there's going to be some consolidation in the industry from this as they try and manage through this, especially at the lower tiers. So it's going to be very tricky as they manage to turn this back on, because as you know, you don't just turn it off and then turn it back on in one day. It's probably going to be based on discussions that most of the suppliers have had with their customers, a 4 to 5 week process to get this up and running again. Okay.
Thank you for that thorough response. I appreciate that, Burton. And you beat me to a couple of my follow-up questions, but is there anything that you could expand on maybe around finance or grappling in terms of working capital?
Well, in talking to them, they're all struggling with inventory. You know, they had all this influx come in, and now they're trying to build and overship as quickly as possible to get their accounts payable and accounts receivable balanced again. So they're definitely going to try and manage their capital, and then trying to manage this inventory as it goes in and goes out is very challenging, especially because of some of the things they've had to deal with because of the banking situation that really started in terms of trying to manage the covenants because of the banks who become much more strict in terms of how they manage that process. So that's the real issue for them, is really managing that cash.
Thank you for that feedback. And I think that actually is a pretty good segue when you're talking about the bloated inventory. Rania, my assistant, if you don't mind pulling up the slide deck, and it shows just a little bit of overview on what's occurred over the past 5 years as you've seen the inventory increases. These are just a couple of high-level points for you all to reference. You know, as you can see here, Tesla's inventory levels has been up 45%, General Motors 12%, and Ford around 9%. And to put some ratios in perspective, and we're going to have Mr. Hassenkamp address this in a little more detail. Rania, if you can pull up the next slide for us, please. And what you can see here is just a ratio of inventory required to generate sales. And you can see some fluctuations, a little bit more increase over the past couple of years. And Peter, if there's something that you would like to talk to on this and maybe give a little bit of your insight.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Yeah, I think the data here shows, I think the influence of a few things on companies, right? Certainly, the number of global disruptions to the supply chain, the frequency has been increasing, right? We're down to sort of every 1.5 years or so that there's a significant disruption, whether that's a natural occurrence, an earthquake or tsunami or whatever the case may be, or a political disruption, wars breaking out, and those sorts of disruptions, driving uncertainty into the supply chain. You've got supply chain being front and center, as a result of that, as a result of the semiconductor crisis, as a result of the pandemic, right? Any manufacturing company now is keenly aware of their supply chain and has challenged all of their supply chain leaders, right, to build resiliency. And what does resiliency mean? In these days, everyone tries to implement as much supply chain knowledge and information flow as possible, right, and get as deep into their tiers of suppliers to know where all those inventories are at, how stable those suppliers are. But at the end of the day, there's very little perfection to those techniques. So having selective and targeted buffer stock inventory is really, at the end of the day, the best way to build some safety margin into your supply chain. And you're also seeing some of the sales forecast uncertainty driving this as well. Certainly the strike over the last several weeks, surprised some of the automakers, right? Some of those strikes were not expected at certain plants, and that means those plants shut down and their entire supply chains, which can be 26 plus weeks long of material in transit and in fabrication, suddenly start ballooning. Right. So all of that, I think all of these influences are driving companies to hold higher inventory, at the same time where credit rates are increasing, and all the things that Bert mentioned, right, are putting financial pressures on companies to try to reduce inventory. And those things are inherently at odds with each other.
And Peter, to expand on that, anything that you could share with your experience as to how you might be trying to improve your working capital, any tools out there that you would think about implementing, certainly something like TCC, what that might look like within your quiver of opportunities?
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, I think every supply chain leader's first tool that they try to implement is supply chain intelligence, really to get smooth, fast communication across all your tiers of suppliers, try to make sure your forecasts are as accurate as they can be, and then understand your full supply chain, and what's that length of time from, if you're talking about an automotive seat, for example, a leather tannery at the very start of your supply chain, making your leather or fabrics, right, that then has to go through a whole supply chain to get to a seat manufacturer, to be built into a seat, come all the way to a factory to install it. You start with supply chain intelligence to try to manage that, but inherently you've got each one of those steps has its own lead times, transportation times to get the materials through this very long chain, ultimately to the factory that builds the vehicle. So you start with supply chain intelligence, and then try to use that to then selectively put buffer stock along the supply chain where it costs you the least, right? Where if you want to stock raw materials that are cheaper than finished goods, you try to do those things selectively. But as you can see, even with all that work, you're still seeing inventory levels going up across all the automakers and all major manufacturers. So then a service like what TCC offers starts making a lot of sense, right? TCC offers a company an ability to balance these conflicting priorities of reducing finance impacts and reducing inventory with the need to build supply chain resiliency, right? And TCC can offer that financial service of freeing up that working capital while still allowing a manufacturer to maintain some of that buffer stock inventory that gives them the safety margin they need.
Right. Well, thank you so much for expanding on that. That was a thorough response. I appreciate it. And I'm going to throw the ball over to you, Mandeep. What would you consider as your priorities over the next few quarters, given the resources and the tools that you have on hand? What does that look like?
Yeah. No, first, I think Bert and Peter did a very nice job. Having now recently just, past months joined Automotive myself. So wearing big blue like you did, Bert, back early in your career, it's really interesting. And I've had the privilege of working in an aviation industry, then kind of the industrial building management, and now automotive. So those supply chain resiliency, skill set, collaboration, some of the keywords that Bert and Peter mentioned, they are translatable, right? It goes to everywhere. So if you're a supply chain professional, I would say hats off to you, right? And I'll share a quick advert. The US ran out of toilet paper, right? You all remember back in 2020. And if you look at the bill of material of toilet paper, it's two items, the brown cardboard and the white paper. And I don't know what was going on there, right? So you see very quickly exactly how Bert and Peter highlighted is something of a pandemic or something just of starting and stopping or a 50-day strike, how quickly it brings everything down, right? And now the thing I always say is to exactly your question, Todd, the restart is usually painful too, right? It's easy to hit the off button, but when you're rebooting that computer, it goes through its process steps. And I think that's what people have to learn. So to directly to your point is, first you got to get the visibility. Immediately, where is everybody, right? If to Bert's point, if there's a labor shortage at a tier 2, tier 3 supplier, we got to get that visibility now. Not when I need that part on the assembly line itself, but how do I get that visibility today? And then, the customer still has flexibility. Somebody wants a blue color, somebody wants a red, somebody wants tan leather, somebody wants something. So that flexibility is innately going to have to be built to kind of drive that. And then, I've always viewed supply chain as a part of a big engine and then a bunch of the train cars behind it. It's all connected end to end. Any one of them has an issue, any one of them kind of stops, the whole system kind of struggles. And then what you end up getting, my second analogy, being living in the Northeast here for 10 years, traffic jams. It's like a compression spring, right? You're always wondering, let me keep jumping lanes. My wife yells at me when I do that. She goes, you realize you never actually get ahead, but it feels good, right? Because you didn't get stuck, you went to another lane. So what I would say is that compression spring is what we've got to alleviate. Inventory is just one buffer, right? Making somebody work 3 shifts is another thing that you can go and do. So to kind of answer your question, those are the things we got to go focus on is where is the issue right now and where is it going to come? And I'll tell you today, we're just worried about tomorrow, right? We're not even thinking about next week or the week after that. It's let's stabilize what tomorrow looks like. And then from there, you slowly got to get it. Because remember, one thing we all need is just time in the day. If you had enough time at any situation, you could figure out alternate ways to get around it. It's when you're always in the reactive phase, you find out after the fact. So that's where the technology helps. That's where that collaboration and coordination, everything coming together. So that's kind of the focus right now is how to get business back to where it was and then meeting the demands of our customers and hitting our business objectives.
It's a lot of cats to herd right there. There's a
Yeah.
lot of lane changes to your point of managing that process. And Gen 1, I think you have a little bit different perspective. You've certainly been with the big automotive now with Tesla, and now you're with an EV startup. What does that look like? And I'm sure that being a startup, there's still some nuances that apply to some of the bigger supply chain issues. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for that question. I think when you're launching and building and scaling your product, regardless of if you're a startup or a traditional OEM, ramping and making a product at scale is heavily capital intensive. I think some of the challenges that we face as a startup or startups in general is that you're not necessarily going to get the support of established suppliers in the ancillary industries, and so you have to find the right partners that are willing to invest and take that risk on. And by taking that risk on, kind of touching on the topics that Mandeep, Bert, and Peter were saying, there's risk in taking on that working capital on behalf of that startup. They're buying the raw materials, they're hiring the labor, they're looking for those forecasts to materialize. And like you said earlier on, Todd, what's the difference between a good forecast and Bigfoot? Well, Bigfoot's been sighted, right? And so being able to kind of weather that storm along with the customer and being able to grow with the customer and finding the right partners to be able to do that within the industry, I think are the bigger challenges. And I think it's a similar challenge that any OEM, larger and established, would face as well. You're not going to be able to dual source. A lot of these activities that the automotive industry does is heavily capital intensive. And so, it's not always easy to dual source. You can't always have 5 body stamping suppliers and 2 seating manufacturers and 3 harness suppliers. And so being able to take that risk on together and having kind of the tools like One TCC to leverage that ability to manage working capital is going to be a big thing for startups and established companies alike.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gen 1. And I think you touched on something that I'm going to throw the ball back over to Peter. And we briefly touched on it, but when you start talking about solutions, in all of your experience, what does that look like, Peter? Maybe you can expand on that a little bit from, the implementation of a new tool and maybe something like TCC. How does that impact your operations, your team? What does that look like for you? And maybe, with your experience, there might be some younger team members that are on the call right now, and there may be some real experienced team members that are looking to really optimize right now in this time frame of improving their efficiency. So what can you share on that?
Sure. And I think I think it's safe to say, I'd speak for, I think, most people in most organizations, that the last thing they want to do is have another organization, the IT team or the finance team, come to them and say, hey, we need you to implement a new IT solution here, or and it's going to be, you know, a 6 month long disruption to your current operations, right? And you know, particularly in supply chain, as Jinwa or as I think Mandeep was saying, right, you're planning for tomorrow, right? And you anything new, once you've got this house of cards set up, the last thing you want to do is implement a new tool that's supposed to improve things, and almost inevitably you know, causes you know a learning time and some disruption, some anticipated confusion or disruption to what was already working. So I think that's also something TCC is very cognizant of, right? And the goal here with what TCC offers is to not change any of the physical flow of goods, right? But to provide a manufacturing company a financial solution to working capital, right, with the least amount of disruption to systems or any kind of physical flow of goods or the communications, right? So you know, as a supply chain leader, you would like to see the least amount of disruption possible, right? And no, you know, no effect on physical flow of goods, no effect on the forecasting. So, you know, with the TCC solution, I think you achieve a lot of that, right? There is not a separate piece of software that has to be implemented, right? A company does not have to incorporate a new piece of software that has to interface with their ERP system or their finance system. They don't have to change the physical flow of goods at all. They don't have to change their forecasting and communications with suppliers. There is an incorporation of messaging, right? TCC has to then step in and be able to see a lot of the same forecasts and messages and transactions that the company is sending to its suppliers. But I think the nice thing is that it's a fairly light lift, and there isn't a separate platform that has to be incorporated into existing systems, which saves a lot of headaches and implementation timing and just IT disruption.
Right. Thank you for that thoughtful response. And to maybe dovetail on that a little bit, Bert, you know, you've overseen procurement supply chain in Asia and Africa. You know, what strategies at your personal level, you know, kind of reflecting on it, would you have done previously to help with an inventory situation, maybe while you were at Ford, and what would you suggest to some of the audience members?
Well, you know, inventory has changed in terms of how we manage it specifically over the last 5 or 6 years. When you think about it, the buzzword 10 years ago was just in time, right? Everybody wanted to be just in time, and that was everything. The strike in 19 with General Motors, the launch with Ford in Chicago, the pandemic, the shift, that's changed everybody's whole perspective on inventory. And it's really, you have to understand the things that Peter talked about in terms of supply intelligence. What is the lead time? What do you need? Because every shoe is not made the same. And so you have to understand what each situation is. And so some places you may need 2 weeks inventory. Some you may be able to get away with 2 days. It also depends on the level of competition you have in terms of interchangeability, in terms of the parts. So it has changed dramatically over the last several years because of mobility. And you're dealing with a whole different supply base in the auto industry in a lot of ways. You know, as we've entered into this mobility sector, as we've entered into electrification, there's a lot more different suppliers that you have to deal with, and they're not accustomed to the traditional relationship that the OEs have had. And so the OEs are not necessarily at a point of leverage like they used to be. And in order to get the things done that need to get done, there's a whole mind shift that has to occur in terms of how you deal with suppliers. When I was at Ford, we had a whole different set of terms and conditions that we had to deal with as it related to EV and mobility suppliers, because they're not willing to accept the same things that your traditional suppliers, such as the Bosches and the Continentals and of the world are willing to accept. So the game has changed, and you got to manage it almost on an individual basis in terms of what you have to do and what you have to understand.
Well, great segue there. And I think a very thoughtful response, Bert. And you touched on a few points that I thought were very interesting, as well as Peter did earlier. You might have some special products, maybe some leather goods, something that is going to impact your supply chain. You got to know your lead time. You really have to know what you need well in advance. And what we're seeing right now is a big transition from combustion related engines to EV. And real quick before we turn it over to Mandeep and Jinwan, is Bert, what would you think is going to happen? How is that going to be impacting the supply chain?
Well, I think we're already seeing tremendous impacts in the supply chain relative to the transition. I also think the transition is beginning to happen slower than people anticipated. And I think that's going to create lots of issues. I mean, there's infrastructure issues, there's cost issues, raw material availability issues that people are trying to manage through, and just general customer acceptance in terms of range anxiety and things of that nature. So I think the transition will occur. I just think it's going to be much longer than people anticipated, which puts pressure on investment on both sides, because now you have to invest longer in these ICE engines than you anticipated, while still trying to figure out how to manage the large investment for EVs. Now, I don't know if any of you heard the Ford earnings call this week, but they have said they're going to slow down on their $12 billion investment in EVs in terms of how they have to manage it. Because then today they still have to run the company, and the company still has to make money. And so it's a matter of one of our old CEOs at Ford had a theory. You have to have 1 foot in today and 1 foot into tomorrow, and trying to manage through that process. And it was an infinity diagram that he used to draw, because it's a never-ending circle. And so, there's no more time that's going to be more difficult in terms of trying to manage today's business while getting into tomorrow's. And so trying to get into this EV business is going to be very challenging in terms of the type of investment you have to make.
Thank you for that feedback. That's some good insight there. And Mandeep, we'll turn it over to you. With your experience in automotive and where you are, what's your take? Do you think that the automotive industry is reluctant? Do you feel like they're slow to adoptive processes and agile tools compared to maybe the high tech and EV industry? Do you see a front runner in this regard?
Yeah, no, I think that it's a great question, and Bert highlighted on something, right? I'll take it outside of the automotive industry for a second. It's change, right? I mean, let's go back to, I'm sure everyone on this call, and even our folks that are joined in, everybody's probably got an iPhone, right? Or some sort of touchscreen, right? And when I was, I'll say, in my early college career in 2000s, BlackBerry, right? You were the coolest thing if you had a BlackBerry, and the buttons you had to feel. And then when the touch screen came, everybody said, "Hey, where'd my buttons go?" Right? But that's the part of change, right? And that whole industry has changed now. You don't really get a phone with buttons on it anymore. I had to buy one for my parents at Christmas, right? You got to search the whole country to figure out where you get one, right? That jitterbug or what it is. But it's change, right? And change takes time, because you're going from point A to point B, right? And that's the focus that you have to do. So exactly how Bert articulated very well is everybody, it's a new way of doing business. Now, if I take it one level above EV and ICE, you're still looking for a moving vehicle to take you from point A to point B. That's not going anywhere, right? Now the method may change and how we get there. So I would call it's a transition state. Part of it is going to be you've got a technology change that's coming. And just like the BlackBerry to touchscreen phones, that took some time, but we were able to figure it out, and now we live behind it. And another data effect I'll show you, I saw it in one of the readings here, is basically what this chart was showing was, what does it take to get up to like 5 million, 10 million, 50 million users, right? And they had things on this chart related to like a TV, a toaster oven, Facebook. They had all this. and the learning curve is phenomenal, right? Now you're taking a industry that's 100 years plus, and you're trying to hit this curve. How are you going to do it when the people that are there today in the industry, the non, I'll say EV high tech industry, they've done it one way, right? It's not flip of a switch and you switch over that way. So I think exactly how Bert said is there's going to be a bit of transition. We'll get it because we still want to move the customer from point A to point B. That problem hasn't gone away. It's just a matter of the mode is going to change, and it's just a bit of time to get through it. So I have full doubt. That's one of the reasons I joined the automotive industry, right? Is to learn and see how you can be part of this transition, how you can be part of this transformation to get to that kind of next generation. So a lot more exciting things will come. This is probably my plug for folks to join the automotive industry if you're looking for an opportunity. But it's come where the change is happening versus where your products are going to remain the same, right? And they're not going to really change. So it'll get there. It's just a matter of time.
Thank you for that. I like your optimism. We appreciate it. We always feel like the industry we're in is the slow one to adopt new technology. But it seems like we're on the right path here. Peter, over to you. So what is the impact of, let's say, a platform such as TCC on day-to-day communication and operations, to suppliers and with different components? And, maybe putting some vernacular around this with regards to vendor managed inventory agreements, what that might look like. Can you offer some insight, some expansion around that?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back, I think, to what Bert was saying, particularly, right? The EV adoption momentum is building, right? But everyone's trying to guess at what that trajectory is. Is it this or is it this, right? And people have been speculating for 5 years. When are we going to hit that inflection point where EVs start becoming a meaningful percentage of vehicle sales? I think you're at that point now, right? You've got Ford and Volkswagen and numerous other automakers, a lot of the Chinese automakers making good electric vehicles. You're seeing that adoption rate increase quickly, but not always as fast as some of the automakers are predicting, right? Ford scaling back some of this. They thought that it was going to go faster than it actually is. You're still seeing a very, significant growth year on year in adoption, but it's regional and it varies by vehicle as well. So this my point being is the forecast, these long-term forecasts that are going to suppliers, right, for a Mustang Mach-E or a Volkswagen ID4, et cetera, are often missing the mark. And so the automakers have been anticipating the EV boom for a while, and they're now in it, but they're not sure how fast it's going to happen. So you've got this inaccuracy in the forecast, also compounded with a lot of suppliers now demanding longer forecasts and longer kind of fixed and firm periods where a customer has to commit to buying this inventory. Semiconductor companies want 52-week forecasts now, right? Even standard automotive suppliers are looking at that kind of 6 to 12 month long forecast and having to buy goods and raw materials and components in that kind of time frame, because these lead times have gotten longer, et cetera, et cetera. So that, again, these are all things that drive inventory up. You've got customers requesting VMI and trying to put some of this inventory, hot potato and inventory ownership onto the suppliers, right? Who naturally don't really want to take that on. And that, again, is where I think TCC offers an interesting solution to balance those demands from the customers with the reluctance of suppliers, and can alleviate some of that by freeing up the working capital and reducing at least the financial burden, if not the physical warehousing of these goods that can still be an issue. But with TCC being kind of a light implementation, not a separate piece of software, it's really a set of parallel communication. So the automaker or the manufacturing company is still sending their forecast directly to the supplier. TCC is a third party getting that information, in parallel, right? So not disrupting the flow of communication, of forecasting, goods shipments, and all of the day-to-day supply chain intelligence and communication that needs to happen between the manufacturer and its suppliers. TCC is getting the messaging in parallel, and then stepping in as the inventory owner, right, taking ownership of those goods while they're in storage or in transit, freeing up that working capital for the manufacturer without, again, disrupting the day-to-day forecasting. So I think it's a pretty minimal impact to the day-to-day operations for a manufacturer, and they still maintain that tight connection with their suppliers and communicating on a day-to-day basis their forecast needs and any changes.
Well, great. You preempted a follow-up question there, Peter. I appreciate that. I mean, you're spot on. Just forecasting, as you mentioned, now getting out to 52 weeks and the importance of it. And thank you for jumping in there and talking about how that correlates through a tool such as TCC. And
a lot of the suppliers are sort of saying, it's take or pay now, right? Especially on the electronic side of things, right? If you try to change those forecasts within a fixed and firm window, and those fixed and firm windows can be getting longer as well, right? Then you've got to take this stuff, and a solution like TCC's at least adds. I liked Mandeep's sort of slinky analogy, right? TCC can add some of this financial kind of buffer where if the inventory booms for, and it takes 3 months to get the forecast back to where it needs to be and moderate a blip in the supply chain, right? TCC can add that financial buffer of basically not having all that inventory hit a company's books, right? And keep the working capital steady for a company, and allow some of this kind of compression and expansion to happen until forecast gets back to a stable level.
thanks for that, Peter. Very good. And Jin-Won, I don't want to leave you out of the conversation here. And you come with a little bit different optics. And you're on a startup that's, I'm going to give you 2 questions with only 26 subparts. But so first question here is, you're really geared up already with EV. What is that? You're not having to convert from combustion to EV. So what does that look like in your planning process? And then would love to hear your contrast of really kind of agricultural automotive and how that might compare or contrast to traditional automotive sector.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's I think there's some similarities between the traditional automotive OEM industry versus what you see in the off-highway tractor industry. We're benefiting a lot from a lot of the innovation development that's happened in automotive. There have been a whole ecosystem and an ancillary supply chain, like Bert had been saying, that is specific to EVs. There's a lot of opportunity. The return on investment has been huge for a lot of these suppliers that have invested in EV technology. For drive units, inverters, BMS technologies, battery cell and module. I think when you look at the vehicle market industry, we're never going to really have the volumes that a single passenger vehicle program will be. We'll never be, a Toyota Camry volume. And so we're highly dependent upon an established industry. We will never be able to go out and say, hey, kind of like what Peter and the team did at Lucid, we're not going to be able to design and build our own drive units. The economics are not going to be there. So going to suppliers that have established technologies is going to be really important for us. But I think the challenges are very similar, kind of resonating from all the things that the panelists have said. It's kind of like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come, maybe. And so as these suppliers build out their technologies and expect customers to come for it, I think pipelining the material, your magnets, your copper, to do all these technologies, and then be able to sit on it for a long enough time for that volume to materialize and for you to see the ROI is going to be, I think, a big challenge for us. And so, again, we're very highly dependent upon an established industry, and providing these suppliers and that ancillary industry the opportunity to leverage and be able to buffer that inventory is going to be very important for us.
Great. That's a great response. I appreciate that. Some good insight. We've got a couple of questions from our audience, and I'd like to throw a couple of them out there to you guys. And Bert, I'm going to start off with you here. This is one of our questions: is how do you see the value? No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Do you believe the U.S. auto industry has a fighting chance against Chinese manufacturers when our supply chains emanate from China?
Do we have a fighting chance? Of course we do. We're America. Our mindset has to change, though. It definitely has to be a different mindset and a different approach. I think that's why you see a lot of the autos taking the approach that some of the what I'll call not just startups, but a lot of the technology companies, they're looking at the upscaling and the mindset of people out in California. I mean, if you look at Ford right now, they've hired a lot of technologists and a lot of thought seekers from that area of the world in terms of how we begin to change and move our mindset toward that of speed and technology adoption, because the car is just really a moving computer at this point. So it's a different mindset. It's a different speed of change as we bring new technologies into it. And we have utilized a lot of the labor force from some of these emerging countries, such as China, such as Mexico. And, you know, that's going to be an interesting shift in terms of what we've done with this new labor contract with the UAW and how that's going to impact the potential offshoring of jobs once again, as we've tried to bring more back in here so we could take more control of our destiny. There are some things that I think we absolutely need to control, and there's some things that are going to be more difficult for us to control because, for example, a lot of raw materials that go into EVs and things of that nature are not here in the United States. And so there's some things that we have to manage through relationships with foreign countries. And so there are things we can control and things we can, and we got to manage through that process and build the relationships that allow us to be successful.
Jim, on from a agricultural standpoint, manufacturing, anything that you would want to expand on that? And then after that, certainly Mandeep or Peter, if there's anything you'd want to add.
From a manufacturing standpoint, you know, I think we try to remain very asset light. A startup or launching any product, I think, in the context of these challenging times, you know, raising money is challenging. Interest rates are high. So I think the contract manufacturing model will be something that will be of, I think, value to the wider industry. We're using a contract manufacturer currently out in Ohio, and I think if you look at Fisker, they're also using I think Magna out in Austria, and so I think the contract manufacturing model might be something that might come back into you know, a strategic opportunity to start and ramp and launch products.
Peter, Mandeep, anything that you guys would want to add? Mandeep, I'll go to you first. If there's anything that you might want to add to that and our competitiveness in China, managing the supply chain from foreign countries.
No, I mean, I'm with Burton, and what I would say is healthy competition is good, right? And this is where, you know, if you think about it, these technological advancements that we've seen, even in automotive and other industries, it's when groups came together, right? At some point, you know, what country, what region, where are you at? It doesn't matter. You have a strategic vision and you're going to go execute and go make that happen. And then it's going to take partners because, right, there probably isn't a single country in the world that has everything that they need to survive. So I would say you're going to have to partner with somebody. You're going to have to work, whether it's raw materials, it's manufacturing, it's technology, human potential, whatever that is. So you bring it together. But, you know, I would double down on the US, right? And I'm sure we love the competition. We're competitive as anything, right? And just let the best teams win.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add. I think it's well covered.
Okay. Well, and that, you know, Bert, you brought up a good point that, you know, we're trying to onshore these manufacturing jobs, bring them back. The new contract might have an impact. You know, what is the current conversation regarding measures? This is one of the questions from our audience. What is the current conversation regarding measures to mitigate labor costs in the automotive industry? Is working capital expected to be affected? I'm going to throw that up to anybody. Go ahead and raise your hand and I'll let you jump in there. No one wants to take that one? A little too much hair on it?
Oh, yeah, I think Bert, you're probably closest to it being in Detroit and probably tied in with a lot of this, but it's going to be a challenge, right? I saw one publication from Ford saying that it's going to add $800 to $900 per vehicle built. And that's definitely going to put a lot of pressure on the organization, right, to find compensations elsewhere with efficiency, whether it's in the supply chain and parts produced or the engineering to simplify vehicles, or whatnot. So I think it's definitely going to put a lot of pressures and put people on point to come up with more ways of finding cost savings in other areas.
Yeah, Peter's right. I think the jury's still out. I think people are going to have to figure out partnerships in a very different way than they have before, and work together collaboratively to offset these costs. From a design and engineering perspective, what I know is not going to happen is, in this particular time, you just can't go to suppliers and ask for a cost reduction. There's going to have to be some level of partnership and working together to figure this out, because it's just not going to happen by itself.
Well, and that's a very interesting segue there, Bert. We just got a question that popped up regarding cost escalations, and here's the question: is how do you see value being delivered by a program such as TCC that it offers in terms of hedging against cost escalations and inventory disruptions? Mandeep, Bert, Peter, John, Jen, John, anything that you guys want to add to that?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of, I always view it very simply as my supply chain, as I said, translated, right? Everybody wants delivery, quality, cost, kind of on a pyramid. So everybody wants it all, right? What I always get back to is there's agreement, right? And then there's alignment. So if you're a consumer of automotive, you're going to have to think through that. If you're a supplier partner, you're going to have to think through that, because a simple MBA equation I remember was revenue minus cost equals profit. Keep it that simple, right? So if everybody wants to work through that, you're going to have to go with it. And one example I can share from aviation perspective, our agreements were always 3, 4, 5 years longer. I mean, once you got on a platform, you went there. I mean, some of you are maybe historians, but the B-52 bomber, right? That thing's been out there for ages now, and everybody is still wanting to be on that platform. So that's what I would kind of think of as, don't be, if you're from a supply chain perspective, don't try to create a partner for today. Try to create a partner that's going to be with you for that platform life, right? And that's what it really feeds on to Bert's earlier comments, is that's to change the mindset, right? I've got to get out of it. Hey, today I have a purchase order, tomorrow I don't. You can't think that way, right? You got to be here for the long run. You got to enjoy the pain. You got to give and take. And the thing that I've learned through all my, say, the 3 different industries is, the more you form a partnership, the better chance you have. But if it's just a business transaction, somebody's going to do the math and say, you know what, I'll make a little bit less, right? Or, you know what, I just don't want to do business because this product doesn't mean, it's not part of my strategy. So that's what I would say a key word that's been shared is collaboration and partnership. And the more you focus on that, the rest of the math will work itself out.
Build on that, I think, Todd, kind of going back to the question as well, is working capital is part of the equation when the suppliers submit the cost and the cost model to the customer, right? And so if they're having more trouble, if they're too leveraged that they can't get better terms on their capital, if there are tertiary ways of finding that, kind of like using a tool like one TCC, then there are opportunities, like Bert was saying, gone are the days where you go, hey, it's 3 times 3% productivity over the first 3 years. And then, you automatically have a visibility of, 9-10% cost reductions to the program. Like Mandeep was saying, we have to find ways to work collaboratively. And so being able to provide and collectively give tools to the suppliers in order for them to be able to pass on those reductions is going to be a big part of how we need to work with the supply base and the ancillary industry.
Thanks for that. We've got several more questions and we're about down to 9 minutes. So I'm going to pick one or two. We'll see if we can just kind of fill this in and maybe give some people some time back. And this was one that just came in. We are a tier 1 supplier, and it's always been hard for us to forecast business with OEMs, even in the normal course of business. And the strike has added more uncertainty. Can one TCC or a platform such as this give a better forecast process or something equivalent to tide over the chaotic times? I'm going to lob this one over to one of you guys. Who wants to take it?
I mean, I can jump in there. I mean, I think this kind of goes a little bit back to my Slinky analogy here a little bit, right? TCC is not going to be able to improve the forecast accuracy, unfortunately. You're going to need a soothsayer or a fortune teller to do that, perhaps. But I think where TCC can help was a little bit in terms of if you've got this forecast disruption where, the forecast is up here and the demand's actually here, and that results in some ballooning inventory, right? TCC can offer a financial means of kind of absorbing those bumps, right? Physically, you're going to have physical goods in your warehouse, but on your books, the financial burden would be taken over by one TCC. It wouldn't draw down your working capital, right, to be holding that extra inventory, right, until that forecast then comes down and everything kind of rides out to it back to a stability point. So, right, if that takes 3-4 months for that blip in inventory and that forecast inaccuracy, right, to work its way through the system, right, and for the physical goods inventory to balloon up and then come back down to a normal long-term level, what TCC offers, right, is that they'll take over the ownership of that inventory so that it doesn't appear on your books, and you can have it, have a more stable financial working capital through that period. So it's a partial solution. I think it mitigates some of the business impacts of forecast inaccuracies.
Thanks, Peter.
Well, I was gonna add on just a couple comments there. Is, if somebody can fix forecast accuracy, I'd love to meet with them after, right? Think of the word itself. It means forecast, right? Look at the weather outside, wherever you go. So inherently, the word itself doesn't say fixed, right? And that's where, to Peter's point, is supply chains try to do different things. There's plenty of tools out there. There's plenty of gurus and pundits that have ideas, and management consulting companies that say, go do this, right? But again, it comes back to, it's a forecast, right? So exactly how Peter said it is, using the slinky, or I have another analogy for you. The cartilage between your bones, that's the buffer you got to create so you don't get that bone-to-bone rubbing. And that's what I believe the TCC model can help offer is instead of getting that friction or getting that, what I call the collaboration or partnership with a supplier and their OEM, is find the cartilage in the middle, right? So you don't have to have friction, because remember, without TCC, you're still in it for the partnership for the long run. What you need is that buffer in the middle to help protect that time period. And that's what the TCC platform can truly offer, is how do you get through this period? How do we help through this transition so we can get to the next? So again, I can say it, I haven't seen anybody that can completely fix your forecast accuracy. But what I have seen is companies like TCC that can help industries, a partner and their group together, work and see how we can buffer that, right, for the time period.
Thanks. I think we've got one time or a little more time for just one more question, since we're about 5 minutes and from one of our attendees and it brings up buffer. So with all of the bigger car manufacturing increasing inventory buffer for higher sales, et cetera, how do you think the automation systems in the plants are going to be affected? Machines have certain capacity and utilization limits, but it sounds like this situation keeps bottlenecking production year by year. What would be your take on that? What would be your take on that? Let me know if you want me to repeat any part of that question.
I think this kind of goes to Bert's opening comments around labor, right? It's wonderful to have a machine, and you know what capacity that machine has, right? But that machine can only hit that capacity if it's got the staffing to go along with it. And people talk about automation and how much of a factory, whether it's automotive or elsewhere, can be automated, but you still have to have people operating those machines, right? So if you've got a tight labor market, right, that's going to then affect your ability to ramp up, ramp down, right, that factory, those machines, right, and try to compensate for forecast inaccuracies or supply chain disruptions.
All right, one more. This is a real quick one here. And this one just came through. We already have SAP Ariba implemented. How does the one TCC platform work for us? Will it replace Ariba? Mandeep, do you want to take that one, or Peter, either one?
Yeah, no, I can. So I just want to make sure I follow. The client already has SAP Ariba. How do they work with one TCC?
Correct.
That's it. Okay. No, so yeah, nothing on your side. So one of the things you want to think of, the term I use for one TC, we want to be a ghost in the process, right? So think of that relationship that you have with your supplier partner where you're sharing demand, you're sharing future forecasts, purchase orders, procure to pay, all of that. That stuff is going to exist as your relationship. Where we are working through is just think of the execution in terms of the intent to buy. One TCC will work through that. So there's definitely lots of scenarios that can come in there, but the expectation today would be is you're not going to go away from your Ariba, because we want you to maintain that relationship. We want you to maintain that partnership, because that's your success to the future, right? That's your success to deliver to the customer. So what it would do is it would be an enabler and a connection to it, which we've got a lot of our technology team that looks at the APIs, that looks at the connections in between, and they kind of tie together.
Great. Well, you summarized that perfect. We're down to 2 minutes. I'm going to thank all of our registrants and attendees for being a part of this conversation. Certainly a big thank you to each one of our panelists here for bringing your knowledge and your insight into the supply chain, into the automotive industries. I'm going to kind of speak off the cuff here. If any of our attendees have additional questions you would like us to address of any of our panelists, we would certainly pass those along. We'd be happy to make that connection and respond in kind. To our panelists, thank you very much. We hope you have a great rest of the day. This will be available online, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the week. Take care.